Before we begin, take a moment to support the channel. Subscribe and like the video. It really helps us share real history and bring important stories like this to more people. The Marshall Plan. Rebuilding Europe. After the Second World War, in 1945, when the Second World War finally ended, Europe was in ruins. Entire cities had been reduced to rubble, transportation systems were destroyed, industries had stopped functioning, and millions of people were homeless or starving. The war had not only destroyed buildings and infrastructure, it had shattered economies and societies. Many European countries faced economic collapse, political instability, and the threat of widespread poverty. In this fragile moment, the United States proposed one of the most ambitious recovery programs in modern history, the Marshall Plan. The Marshall Plan, officially known as the European Recovery Program, ERP, was a massive economic aid initiative launched by the United States to help rebuild Western Europe. It was named after U.S. Secretary of State George C. Marshall, who announced the idea in a famous speech at Harvard University on June 5, 1947. The plan would eventually provide more than $13 billion in economic assistance to European nations between 1948 and 1952. Adjusted for modern values, this would equal more than $100 billion today. But the Marshall Plan was not simply about money. It was about rebuilding hope, stabilizing democracies, and preventing another devastating conflict in Europe. Europe in ruins. When the war ended in 1945, Europe faced one of the worst humanitarian and economic disasters in its history. Many of the continent's major industrial centers had been heavily bombed. Cities like Warsaw, Berlin, Dresden, Rotterdam, and many others were almost completely destroyed. Factories had been bombed or dismantled, railways were damaged, bridges were gone, and ports were unusable. Agriculture was also devastated. Fields had been turned into battlefields, farm equipment had been destroyed, and many farmers had been killed or displaced. Food shortages became widespread. In several countries, rationing continued for years after the war ended. Millions of refugees wandered across Europe. Former prisoners of war, survivors of concentration camps, forced laborers, and civilians displaced by fighting struggled to find homes and rebuild their lives. Governments were overwhelmed by the scale of destruction. At the same time, economies were collapsing. Industrial production in many countries had fallen to less than half of its pre-war level. National currencies were unstable, inflation was rising, and international trade had nearly stopped. Without functioning economies, European countries struggled to provide jobs, housing, and basic services to their citizens. The winter of 1946 to 1947 made the situation even worse. It was one of the coldest winters in decades. Coal shortages caused factories to close, trains stopped running, and millions of people faced freezing temperatures without sufficient heating. Food shortages increased, and many feared famine. Europe needed help, and quickly. The growing fear of communism. While Europe struggled to recover, another political danger was growing. The Soviet Union had emerged from the war as one of the most powerful nations in the world. Soviet forces occupied large parts of Eastern Europe, including Poland, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, and East Germany. In these countries, communist governments began to take power, often supported by the Soviet Union. Many Western leaders feared that economic instability in Europe could allow communism to spread further west. Communist parties were gaining popularity in countries like France and Italy. In societies suffering from poverty, unemployment, and political chaos, radical political movements often attract support. Some American leaders worried that if European economies collapsed, democratic governments could fall and communist regimes might replace them. The United States began to see economic recovery in Europe not only as a humanitarian responsibility, but also as a strategic necessity. A stable and prosperous Europe would be less likely to fall under Soviet influence. George Marshall's historic speech. On June 5, 1947, U.S. Secretary of State George C. Marshall delivered a speech at Harvard University that would change the future of Europe. Marshall was a respected military leader who had served as the Chief of Staff of the U.S. Army during the war. He understood the devastation that Europe had experienced and believed that economic recovery was essential for lasting peace. In his speech, Marshall explained that Europe's recovery required a coordinated effort and that the United States was willing to help. He declared that the United States should do everything possible to assist in the return of normal economic health in the world. Without economic stability, he warned, there could be no political stability and no assured peace. Marshall emphasized that the initiative must come from Europe itself. European countries would need to work together to identify their needs and create a plan for recovery. The United States would then support that effort financially. The proposal was bold. It suggested that the United States would provide massive economic assistance to rebuild entire nations. At first, many people were unsure whether such a plan could work, but the idea quickly gained support among both American and European leaders. Planning the recovery. After Marshall's speech, European countries began meeting to discuss a coordinated recovery plan. 16 nations eventually agreed to participate in the program. These countries included the United Kingdom, France, West Germany, Italy, the Netherlands, Belgium, Denmark, Norway, Sweden, Switzerland, Austria, Greece, Turkey, Ireland, Portugal, and Iceland. Together, they created the Committee for European Economic Cooperation, which evaluated the economic needs of each country and proposed a coordinated plan for rebuilding industries, restoring trade, and stabilizing currencies. The United States Congress debated the proposal intensely. Some American politicians questioned whether such a large financial commitment was necessary. Others worried about spending billions of dollars abroad, while the United States still faced domestic challenges. However, growing tensions with the Soviet Union convinced many leaders that the Marshall Plan was essential. Supporting European recovery was seen as an investment in global stability. In April 1948, the U.S. Congress officially approved the European Recovery Program. The Marshall Plan had begun. How the Marshall Plan worked. Between 1948 and 1952, the United States provided more than $13 billion in economic assistance to participating European countries. This aid came in several forms. First, the United States supplied food, fuel, and raw materials to help European countries meet immediate needs. This prevented famine, kept factories running, and stabilized everyday life. Second, financial aid helped rebuild infrastructure such as roads, railways, bridges, and ports. Transportation systems were essential for moving goods and restarting trade. Third, the program supported industrial modernization. European industries received machinery, equipment, and technical expertise that allowed them to rebuild and improve production. Fourth, the Marshall Plan encouraged economic cooperation among European nations. Countries were encouraged to reduce trade barriers and coordinate economic policies. This cooperation later helped lead to the creation of organizations that eventually evolved into the European Union. The plan also required transparency and accountability. European governments needed to show how they used the funds, ensuring that aid supported recovery rather than corruption. Soviet opposition. Although the Marshall Plan was offered to all European countries, including those in Eastern Europe, the Soviet Union strongly opposed it. Soviet leader Joseph Stalin viewed the program as a threat to Soviet influence. He believed that accepting American aid would allow the United States to interfere in the internal affairs of Eastern European countries. As a result, the Soviet Union rejected the Marshall Plan and pressured Eastern European countries to refuse participation as well. Nations such as Poland and Czechoslovakia initially considered joining but ultimately withdrew under Soviet pressure. Instead, the Soviet Union created its own economic system for Eastern Europe, known as the Council for Mutual Economic Assistance, Comecon. This division between Western Europe and Eastern Europe contributed to the growing tensions of the Cold War. The results of the Marshall Plan. The Marshall Plan is widely considered one of the most successful economic recovery programs in history. By the early 1950s, European economies had begun to recover rapidly. Industrial production increased significantly, agricultural output improved, and international trade expanded. Many countries experienced economic growth that exceeded pre-war levels. Factories reopened, new technologies were introduced, and millions of people returned to work. The plan also helped stabilize currencies and rebuild financial systems, allowing businesses to invest and grow. Equally important was the psychological effect. The Marshall Plan restored confidence in the future. People began to believe that rebuilding was possible. The program strengthened democratic governments across Western Europe and reduced the appeal of communist movements in several countries. The beginning of European cooperation. Another lasting legacy of the Marshall Plan was the encouragement of European cooperation. To manage the distribution of aid, European countries worked together through organizations such as the Organization for European Economic Cooperation, OEEC. This cooperation helped break down economic barriers between nations that had recently been enemies during the war. Over time, these cooperative efforts evolved into deeper political and economic integration. The creation of the European Coal and Steel Community in 1951, followed by the European Economic Community in 1957, eventually led to the formation of the European Union. In this way, the Marshall Plan played a role not only in rebuilding Europe, but also in shaping its long-term unity. Impact on the United States. The Marshall Plan also benefited the United States in several ways. First, a stronger European economy meant more trading partners for American goods. European countries used some of the aid to purchase American products, which helped stimulate the U.S. economy. Second, rebuilding Europe created stable allies during the Cold War. Western European countries became close partners of the United States in organizations such as NATO. Third, the program strengthened America's global leadership and demonstrated the power of economic cooperation rather than military force. Criticism and debate. Although the Marshall Plan was widely praised, it also faced criticism. Some critics argued that European economies might have recovered on their own without such massive American aid. Others believed the program was primarily motivated by American strategic interests rather than humanitarian concerns. Some historians also argue that the plan helped expand American influence over European economies and politics. However, most historians agree that the Marshall Plan significantly accelerated Europe's recovery and contributed to political stability during a fragile period. The end of the program. The Marshall Plan officially ended in 1952. By that time, Western Europe had largely recovered from the immediate destruction of the war. Although many challenges remained, European nations were once again capable of sustaining their own economic growth. The success of the Marshall Plan became a model for future international aid programs and development strategies. Legacy of the Marshall Plan. Today, the Marshall Plan is remembered as one of the most important economic and diplomatic initiatives of the 20th century. It demonstrated how international cooperation and economic assistance could rebuild entire societies after devastating conflict. The program helped transform a continent devastated by war into one of the most prosperous and stable regions in the world. Perhaps most importantly, it helped create a foundation for peace in Europe. After centuries of frequent wars between European powers, the post-war period has been one of the longest eras of peace on the continent. The Marshall Plan did not solve every problem, but it helped set Europe on the path toward recovery, cooperation, and stability. Conclusion: in the aftermath of the Second World War, Europe faced destruction on a scale rarely seen in human history. Cities lay in ruins, economies had collapsed, and millions of people struggled to survive. The Marshall Plan offered more than financial aid. It offered a vision of recovery and cooperation. By providing economic assistance, encouraging collaboration among nations, and supporting democratic institutions, the Marshall Plan played a crucial role in rebuilding Europe. Its success proved that international solidarity and long-term investment could help heal the wounds of war and create a more stable world. Even decades later, the Marshall Plan remains a powerful example of how nations can work together to rebuild after catastrophe and prevent future conflict.